think with me for a moment, and I'm going to describe an experience, and you tell me if you resonate with this experience or have had something similar happen in your life. So it's maybe like Sunday, Saturday afternoon. I'm feeling a little tired. Me and Christian Ann have a little conference, and we decide that there's enough margin for me to take a nap, which excites me because I'm tired. So I go downstairs, and I lay down in my bed, and my body is still, and I just await the sleep. I wait for it to come, and I wait, and I wait, and my mind starts jumping back and forth to different things I got to do, different things I haven't done yet, strange ideas, and then 10 minutes later, I look over at my little timer that I set for myself, and I cringe because I'm like, oh man, I just lost 10 minutes of sleep. Then it keeps going, and then I succumb, and I grab my phone, I start flipping through email or text, and then pretty soon, I'm halfway through the timer, and I just call it. I'm like, I'm not actually going to sleep. My body is just going to not move for a little while. I don't know if any of you have had that sort of experience before, where your body is at rest, but you're still experiencing a restlessness. Your body is at rest, but you're experiencing a restlessness. And I think that's a kind of trivial example from my life, but I've noticed how that translates to other experiences and other times in my life where I can fight for maybe stopping something, like we've been talking about with this practice of Sabbath. We can fight for a space to stop, but it doesn't mean that it inherently comes with rest. Doesn't mean that it inherently comes with the deep rest that we might be longing for in that stopping. I've learned that rest is hard because we hold so many things. So many things are grabbing for our attention. So many demands are on our lives that rest has to be something active in my life. It's not something passive that just comes to me. It's something that I need to cultivate. It doesn't just happen like me sitting there with my body still, but my mind not so still. If we're not intentional with rest, we can just come out of the other side of stopping, like we've been encouraging you to do, sometimes even more restless. So that raises the question, how do we, and as we've been talking this month, we've been talking about Sabbath, which that word literally means stop. It also means rest and a couple other things. But if we're creating the space to stop, how do we actually cultivate rest so we don't have an experience like me in that bed of restlessness even in the midst of stopping? To answer the question how we rest, we might need to go back and ask the question, why are we resting in the first place? What are we hoping for in our rest? What are we doing in our stopping? What is it all about? Tonight I am going to use my authority as the pastor, co-pastor of North City Church, not to tell a Jesus story. You okay with that? Cool. I have you. We'll take a vote. There's a vote. I'm not going to tell a Jesus story, but this is a story in which Jesus lives into and fulfills. It's a story that Jesus sees himself living out and making even more true. And that's the story of the Exodus. When I say Exodus, does that ring a bell for you, maybe from the Old Testament? This season of the Israelites' life and history where they migrated as a people into Egypt and then were there as participants in the economy and then over time became slaves of Egypt and slaves of Pharaoh for nearly 400 years. And the Exodus story, it's like a word of exit, is the story of God rescuing them from that centuries-long slavery in Egypt. And why we're going back to this story is because the practice of Sabbath actually comes out of this moment in the Israelite history. There's actually two versions of the Ten Commandments. Did you know that? There's two moments where they're spoken, not versions, but they're moments where they're spoken in the Old Testament. There's one in Exodus 20 and one in Deuteronomy 5. And they're at different moments in that story of Exodus where God is rescuing his people out of slavery of Egypt. And in the first one, they have just immediately experienced or come out of this experience of 400 years of slavery under this oppressive situation with Pharaoh. And then in Deuteronomy 5, they're about to enter into the promised land. And they've been in the wilderness 40 years. So there's a whole new generation of people who maybe hadn't even experienced slavery. And so the second version that we get of the Ten Commandments, where we hear this invitation for Sabbath, comes in the midst of a people who've experienced many years of oppression and slavery, trying to convey the importance of how they do life to this new generation of people who are stepping into a situation that's a lot more free, a situation that they can make of their own. And so I want to read that part in Deuteronomy 5 where they're giving these 10 commandments, these commandments from God. And these commandments ought to be understood, and they're baked with the language of Egypt. The 10 commandments are given almost in juxtaposition of the people's experience of slavery in Egypt. And both the versions of the 10 commandments start with this proclamation of who God is. And it says, he is the God who brought you out of Egypt. So this is the liberating God saying, this is who I am, and this is what it means to live liberated in the world. This is the liberating God sharing with his people how to live liberated in the world. So this is Deuteronomy 5, 12 through 15. And here we find our why, or one of our whys for Sabbath. God says, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your sons or daughters, nor your male or female servants, nor your ox, nor your donkey, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your town, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Gone all down the list. Can you see the juxtaposition between slavery and forced labor, and all the way down to the foreigners in your midst experiencing rest? Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. So this command is rooted in the narrative of captivity. Remember, you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe this Sabbath day. Eugene Peterson, when he was reflecting on how much of the Sabbath practice comes out of the story of slavery of Egypt, said this: the Deuteronomy reason for Sabbath keeping is that our ancestors in Egypt went through 400 years without vacation. 400 years without, I can't even go like 2 months without vacation. Can you imagine longer than a lifetime? 400 years without vacation. Never a day off. The consequence was they were no longer considered persons, but slaves. Hands, work units, not persons created in the image of God, but equipment for making bricks and building pyramids. Humanity was defaced. That's part of where the Sabbath practice come from. So a lot of times when we throw out the word Sabbath, sometimes we'll just think like, oh, a day off or something like that. But Sabbath in its origins was a lot more punk rock, a lot more rebellious, a lot more resisting a certain way of being. It was a day to celebrate liberation. It was the day to celebrate that God is not the God of Egypt. God is not Pharaoh that demands endless bricks and endless things from us. And we're created in that image, created in that God's image. We're image bearers. We're not human doings, we're human beings, as Pete Scazzaro says. When we look at this in our lives, Sabbath rest is, in that sense, not just a day off, it's an act of resistance. We're resisting, when we practice Sabbath, everything that enslaves us, everything that demands from us, everything that exploits us. It's much more than a wellness program. It's an opportunity to reimagine and rethink who we are, who God is, and to declare to our world in a differentiated way that we are people created in the image of God, and we are more than what we can produce, and we are more than what we can accomplish. In order to rest well, we need to know what we're actually resisting. Another way to ask the question about entering into rest is, what is it that's enslaving you, and how can Sabbath help you resist it? How can Sabbath become a beautiful resistance against the things that demand from us, the things that exploit us? Now, our experience in America is, in a lot of ways, far from the Hebrews' experience in Egypt, and in some ways, not so far. America obviously is not different in some very crucial ways to Egypt's experience, where we built large parts of our economy on the labor of enslaved people. It's in the very fabric of our nation. But on an individual level, we experience Egypt in our own ways, outside of ourselves and inside of ourselves. And I think there's a lot of ways I could riff on how we experience Egypt and how things are demanded of us, how things are imposed in our lives. But I think the message is that we start believing around Egypt in our lives, the lies that are imposed on us are essentially come down to this: you are not enough and you do not have enough. That's kind of the dirty little secret of the American dream that we believe. It looks like a nice house, 2.5 kids, and a fenced-in yard. But obviously, what it can mean is that there is constant competition, constant demands on our lives, constant narratives that say you are not enough and you do not have enough. There are pharaohs outside of us who are demanding endless production from us. There's a pharaoh inside of us that says we need an even larger kingdom and therefore need to exploit others in ways that get us what we want. The gods of America are accomplishment and accumulation. The reason the Hebrews were worked to the bone for 400 years is they were building palaces for Pharaoh. They were building places to store Pharaoh's stuff. And in America, we have no shortage of stuff that we are forming. At the end of the day, Sabbath is a resistance that says, enough. Enough is enough. It says, I am enough, and I have enough to stop in this moment. You know, I think one of the things that's sneaky about our life that ends up stealing a lot of us, that we end up enslaved to, is we don't live in an economy that deals much with bricks and labor much anymore, even though that happens. We live in an attention economy, which means that there is a fierce battle for our attention. And that the most successful companies that exist right now, a lot of them monetize our attention. They get through the screens that we carry or the streets we walk down, they are monetizing our attention. And they give us things like entertaining cat videos and people who do really great hair or people who live these extravagant lifestyles. They put those in front of our faces and they tell us, you are not enough and you don't have enough. And in the process, they're selling us ads. That's sort of the enslavement that we can experience on a daily basis. So how can Sabbath help us say enough to those things? Like, no more. How do we actually resist those things in Sabbath? We started this conversation with saying, in order to experience rest, we have to have some intentionality around it. So The last few weeks, I've been inviting you guys into this practice. I printed it off here, but it's a helpful resource from people called Practicing the Way that actually guide us through an experience of building out a Sabbath practice in our life, if it's something we want to do. And I think this week's experiences that it invites us into actually create a great next step for you if you're like, how does this actually work? How does Sabbath as resistance actually work? The first thing they invite us in to do if we practice the Sabbath is to prepare. So sometimes when you're practicing Sabbath or trying to rest, you spend the first half, like I did, laying there in my bed thinking about all the things that I had yet to do. We set ourselves up to be restful if we're prepared to rest. So this might mean taking some time before you actually take a Sabbath to make sure you have everything you need in your house. All the emails are answered to some degree. I know they're never all the way answered, but that you take some time to actually prepare. And then the biggest part of Sabbath as resistance is deciding what you're resisting, deciding what you're saying no to, deciding what you're going to cut yourself off from for that amount of time. Whether it's your phone, social media, sports, shopping, TV, entertainment, what are you cutting off? What line in the sand are you drawing to say, I can have a relationship with this stream of attention for this amount of time, but today I'm cutting this off because I know that this is a source that can enslave me if I'm not careful with how I'm using it. And the last thing you can do is be attentive to what happens in your own soul when you stop. A lot of times I've experienced this myself, and I get this feedback from others. There is this fear and apprehension to actually stop, to actually practice Sabbath, because you don't know what will happen in the silence, in the stopping. And there's this fear about how it might bring up things with your relationship with God or your relationship with others you might be Sabbathing with. And there might be a lot of strong emotions that happen in the stopping in the silence. And part of the resistance that Sabbath can be is to embrace and walk into those feelings, be able to name them, and to be able to do some investigation about the sources that they're actually coming from. And then having the space to actually feel and experience those things. Like if you haven't had a great relationship with God recently, instead of running from that, or if you've got some big questions, instead of not asking those questions in Sabbath, you have the space to face those things in the presence of God and spend some time actually experiencing the emotions around them. Now, every time I talk about Sabbath, and as we've been going through this, I always hear this sneaky voice in the background, this suspicion that Sabbath can become legalistic. Sabbath can become another religious box to check. And actually, what's confusing if you read Jesus' interactions with Sabbath is that he almost seems anti-Sabbath because he keeps breaking the rules. And in a lot of ways, he's fighting a different problem. In his day, it's become way too legalistic. It's not full of joy. It's become an Egypt almost in and of itself that enslaves people in the midst of it. And so for us, we have to remember what Sabbath is actually for. And what's helpful for me to remember is it's a practice that is a means of grace. It's a practice by which we choose to ultimately experience grace. So my hope for our community is not that we create another box to check, but we create another place in our lives where we can experience the overwhelming grace of God. One of the titles Jesus gives for himself is the Lord of the Sabbath. The Lord of the Sabbath, which in many ways is claiming that he's the same God who liberated the Egyptians, but he now is the one who we meet, full of grace in our practice of Sabbath.